66 years on the throne, over 100 children, a face carved so deeply into stone that 3,000 years of desert wind could not erase it. When Ramesses II died, around 1213 years before Christ, he was approximately 90 years old. Crippled by arthritis, his jaw riddled with abscesses, his spine curving under the weight of a body that had simply refused to stop. He had outlived 12 of his own crown princes. He had outlived his enemies, his wives, his rivals, and very nearly his own empire. And yet, when archaeologists pulled his linen-wrapped body from a hidden cache of royal mummies in 1881, his arms were still crossed in the posture of a god. How does a man born into a military family that seized power barely a generation earlier become the most enduring symbol of pharaonic civilization itself? How does a young commander who nearly lost everything in a single afternoon at Kadesh transform that disaster into a legend of personal invincibility? The answer is not that Ramesses was the greatest warrior Egypt ever produced, or the wisest king, or the most pious. The answer is that he understood something almost no ruler of his age understood. That power is not what you win on the battlefield, but what you make people believe you won long after the dust is settled. To understand Ramesses, you have to understand the dynasty that produced him. His family, the Ramessides, were not ancient blood royalty. They were soldiers. His grandfather, Ramesses I, had been a general and an advisor to the last king of the previous line, a pharaoh so consumed by religious revolution that he had fractured the kingdom in pursuit of one god. When that experiment collapsed, the old priests reclaimed their temples, the old gods reclaimed their altars, and Egypt needed someone who could hold the pieces together. Ramesses I ruled for barely 2 years. His son, Seti I, ruled for around 15, and in that time he rebuilt temples, pushed the borders outward, and began the project his son would complete: the restoration of Egyptian confidence after a century of upheaval. Seti was a soldier king who understood that Egypt's strength lay not in ideology, but in discipline, logistics, and the projection of force. He raised his son on campaign. By the time Ramesses II came to the throne, perhaps in his early 20s, he had already stood at the edges of the empire, had already watched his father negotiate with vassal kings, had already learned that the throne was not a gift but a machine that required constant fuel. The defining military event of his reign came early. In his 5th year as king, Ramesses marched north toward the Levant to confront the Hittite Empire, a rival superpower whose capital lay deep in Anatolia, whose armies had been pressing against Egyptian influence for generations. The two empires collided at Kadesh, a fortified city on the Orontes River, in what may be the earliest battle in human history that we can reconstruct in detail. Ramesses divided his army into 4 divisions and advanced confidently, believing the Hittites were far to the north. He was wrong. The Hittite chariotry, hidden behind Kadesh, struck the middle of his column as it marched in loose order, and the division he personally led, the division of Ra, was scattered in the opening moments. Ramesses found himself nearly alone on the field, cut off from the bulk of his army, surrounded by enemy chariots, with his guards shattered and his lines broken. By every reasonable measure of military history, he should have been killed or captured, and Egypt should have lost its Levantine empire in a single afternoon. He was not killed. Reinforcements arrived, the Hittite pursuit overextended itself, and the battle ground to an inconclusive halt. But a defeat, or even a draw, at the edge of your empire, in your 5th year as king, against the only power on earth that can match you, is a dangerous thing. It invites revolt from vassals, whispers from courtiers, ambition from rivals. Ramesses understood this instinctively, and so, almost immediately, he began to do something extraordinary. He began to tell a different story. Across the walls of temples, in carved relief after carved relief, he presented the battle not as a near catastrophe, but as a triumph of divine kingship. In the official account, Ramesses stands alone against the entire Hittite host. His army has abandoned him. His officers have fled. And he, a single man, favored by the sun god Ammonius, turns and fights and slays the enemy in heaps and drives them into the river. The inscriptions are specific, theatrical, and relentless. They name the enemy. They count the fallen. They quote the god speaking directly to the king. I am with you. I am your father. My hand is with you. Whether Ramesses believed this literally is beside the point. He understood that a king who can define what happened on the field will always defeat a king who merely survived it. And this instinct for narrative, for the monumental image, for the repeated inscription, is the true engine of his reign. He built on a scale no Egyptian king had attempted before. He completed the great hypostyle hall at Karnak. He expanded the temple at Luxor. He carved his temple at Abu Simbel directly into the living rock of a cliff, with 4 colossal seated figures of himself at the entrance, each over 60 feet tall, so that every traveler and every emissary approaching Egypt from the south would meet his face before they met his country. He built a new capital city in the Delta, Ramesses, filled with palaces and temples and imported stone, and he filled it not with the memory of one victory, but with the atmosphere of permanent victory. And he did something even more audacious. He took the monuments of his predecessors and, with characteristic directness, inscribed his own name over theirs. Statues of earlier kings were recarved to bear his cartouche. Temples were extended and claimed as his own. To later generations, and to many of his own subjects, it would appear as though nearly every great monument in Egypt had been built by one man. This was not mere vanity. It was strategy. In a world without mass literacy, without newspapers, without recorded memory beyond stone, the face on the temple and the name on the cartouche were the memory of the state. Ramesses was not lying about his achievements. He was ensuring that his was the only version that survived, and he was relentless in peace as well as war. Years after Kadesh, facing a Hittite empire strained by internal crisis and by the growing threat of the so-called Sea Peoples, Ramesses did something almost unprecedented in the ancient world. He negotiated a peace treaty with the Hittite king, a treaty of mutual defense and non-aggression, and then sealed it with a diplomatic marriage. The treaty survived in copies on both sides, carved in hieroglyphs at Karnak, and pressed in cuneiform on clay tablets at the Hittite capital. It is one of the oldest surviving international peace agreements in human history. It held, more or less, for the rest of his reign. Egypt's northern border went quiet, and Ramesses could turn his energy inward, to building, to administering, to fathering the enormous family that would carry his blood into every corner of the elite. Because the scale of his personal life matched the scale of his monuments. He had multiple great royal wives, chief among them Nefertari, for whom he carved a temple at Abu Simbel that stands as one of the most beautiful surviving works of Egyptian art, and whose tomb in the Valley of the Queens is painted in colors that still glow 3,000 years later. He had dozens of secondary wives, concubines, and daughters. He celebrated said festivals, ritual renewals of kingship, more often and more elaborately than any predecessor. He appointed his sons to high office, placed them in command of armies and temples, and in doing so created a network of loyal, ambitious men who carried his authority into every province. When he finally died, he had ruled so long that most Egyptians had never known another king. His son who succeeded him, Merneptah, was already an old man. But time, which had served Ramesses so faithfully, also worked against his legacy. His reign had been so long and so consuming of resources that his successors inherited estates stretched thin. The temples were full, the borders were quiet, but the treasury was not infinite, and the world beyond Egypt's borders was shifting. The Sea Peoples would soon test the next reign. The empire in the Levant would erode. The colossal monuments would endure, but the political machine that built them would falter. And yet, and this is the final and most important fact about Ramesses, the image survived even as the power faded. For 3,000 years, travelers, conquerors, and scholars encountering the colossal faces at Abu Simbel, the vast inscriptions at Karnak, the broken colossus that inspired poets, saw not a fading empire, but a civilization at its peak. They saw a king so certain of his own divinity that he carved himself into the mountain and dared the centuries to forget him. And the centuries did not. Ramesses II did not conquer the future with armies. He conquered it with stone, with repetition, and with the simple, stubborn insistence that he, and no one else, was the face of Egypt. And in that, at least, he was not wrong.